On his way to work at McDonald's, Seth Sharp passed McDonald's by and just kept driving. Without any idea where he was going or what he was doing, Seth drove out of town into the country, where the newly harvested fields lay dry and barren, with brittle shin bones of old corn stalks forming long rows that appeared to meet in the distance. Seth wasn't drunk or high, but he felt somewhere in between, disconnected from reality. He supposed he had felt disconnected for some time, which explained how he could skip work on a whim and cruise to nowhere with a dumb smile stretched across his face. A few miles outside of town, the tin roof of a small building rose on the horizon. Seth first thought the roof belonged to a shed or barn, but as he drove ahead, it became a small, rural diner. He slowed down and flipped his turn signal on, even though there wasn't another car in sight. Pulling into the dirt parking lot, he read the faded wooden sign mounted to the roof, "Monty's Bar and Grill." He'd never heard of the place. At first, he thought he would just stop out for a drink while he planned his next steps. He already knew McDonald's was in his past. But after he parked his car, he noticed a sign in the window. This one read, "Hiring. See inside." It was just after 4 o'clock on a Thursday, not exactly peak time for a bar and grill, but still Seth found it strange that his was the only car in the parking lot besides a rusty pickup truck from the 80s. However, the empty parking lot signaled to him that working at Monty's Bar and Grill might be significantly less stressful than a fast food restaurant in the middle of town. The promise of a slower pace pushed him through the door. "Hey there, have a seat. Cindy will be right with you," said a pleasant, middle-aged woman behind the bar. Most of the bottles behind her were almost empty. A younger man wearing a greasy shirt and apron sat on the only occupied stool. Seth said, "Thanks, but I'm actually wondering about that hiring sign outside. Could I maybe get an application?" "Dressed to impress, I see," said the young man, his eyes indicating Seth's McDonald's uniform. "Oh, yeah, I used to work there, but I'm looking for a change of pace." Another woman came through the swinging kitchen door next to the bar, saying, "Don't be rude, Alex. A change of pace, huh? Sorry, couldn't help it over here. I think you'll find that here, don't you, Heather?" The woman behind the bar, Heather, nodded slowly. Seth said, "Hi, are you Cindy? I'd really appreciate an application if you have one." Cindy replied, "Well, you've obviously got some kitchen experience. Do you show up on time and sober?" Seth looked down, poorly masking his discomfort. Ordinarily, this would have been an easy yes for him, but that particular day, on which he had skipped work entirely, it felt like a glaring lie. Cindy caught on and said, "Let me rephrase that. Will you show up on time and sober?" "Yes," Seth quickly answered. Cindy looked to Heather, then Alex, who both shrugged at her. She studied Seth slowly, looking him up and down, then said, "Okay, you're hired. If you're available, you can start right now." Seth sputtered, "Oh wait, really? Don't I need to fill out paperwork or—" "Let's worry about that later," Alex interrupted. "I'm about to start prep for the evening. Let's get you an apron and I'll show you the ropes. What should we do about his uniform?" He addressed this last question to Cindy. "He can just cover that up with an apron tonight. If he's still here tomorrow, we'll get him a shirt." Alex slid an empty glass to Heather, stood, and waved Seth toward the kitchen. "Come on then, let's get started." Alex showed Seth around the small kitchen and introduced him to Lee, the dishwasher. "Lee's not too talkative on account of he's deaf," Alex explained. "He's pretty funny once you get to know him, though. Over here's the dry storage, then we have the walk-ins, that's the cooler, and that's the freezer. If you have to go in there, make sure you prop the door open. The lights don't work anymore and the doors are pretty hard to open from inside. And over here we have the line. This is where you and I will spend most of our time." "So is it just us back here? How busy do you guys get?" Seth asked. "Not busy at all. Not for a long time." Seth realized Alex was telling the truth when by 6 o'clock, Monty's only 3 customers had walked through the door, and besides a basket of fries, they only ordered drinks at the bar. When the fries were ready, Alex plated them and gestured for Seth to follow him out of the kitchen. At the bar, he passed the plate of fries to the 2 female customers while giving the male customer a familial pat on the back. The 4 of them all started chatting like best friends while Seth waited awkwardly at the end of the bar. "Need a drink, honey?" Heather asked him. "Oh, no, I'm still on the clock." "Don't worry about it, Seth. This is the whole bunch for the night." This voice belonged to Cindy, who came out of the kitchen with Lee. "Okay, thanks, but I think I'll still pass for now," said Seth. Heather shrugged and joined the others' lively discussion. At the heart of why Seth didn't want to drink, he already felt intoxicated, and not in a pleasant sense. In the first hour or so of his new job, nerves sparked by the sudden and treasonous change in his career had nauseated him. The nerves faded as he settled into the ease of the slow shift, but then his general feeling changed again when he saw his coworkers all huddled around those 3 customers at the bar. While they all joked and laughed, Seth noticed the sign on the front window was flipped to closed. In fairness, he could not remember which side showed when he entered Monty's. He accepted the possibility that someone simply forgot to turn it. "Hey, I think the open sign is backwards," he said above the din of the conversing group. They all dropped quiet and looked at him. "Just leave it," said Alex. "It's a waste of energy to flip that sign every day." Unable to help himself, Seth asked, "Don't you wonder if that's why nobody comes in here? I mean, you're all regulars, obviously, but what about the passersby?" "Hey, Seth, if you're not going to have a drink, at least have a seat," Cindy implored. His nerves tingling, he sat on a bar stool. He looked to each of the others in turn, employees and customers alike, and said, "I promise I'm not trying to be rude. I know I literally just started working here, but what's the deal with this place? Like, how do you guys stay open?" Lee made a series of gestures, and Cindy said, "He wants to know who's going to tell the story." When no one else spoke up, Heather scoffed and rolled her eyes. "All right, fine. Guess it's on me as usual." Heather poured herself a shot, threw it back, and wiped her mouth. Then she leaned forward with her elbows on the bar in front of Seth and began. "Monty Villanueva opened this place in 1982, back when the quarry still operated. You're too young to remember, but this used to be a bustling area. Dozens of workers, visitors, and locals would come here for lunch nearly every day, and most of them came here to hang out after work, too. Monty was actually making plans to expand. He was going to build a separate room, almost a second building, really, attached to the back for a bigger bar. And that probably would have been a worthy investment before the accident." "Go back and tell him about Gail," said the male customer. Heather asked, "You want to tell the story, Rhett? I'm getting there. I'm just trying to set the scene." "Just let her tell it. She knows what she's doing," said one of the female customers. Heather said, "Thanks, Kira. Well, since Rhett brought her up, Gail Kinney grew up around here, knew pretty much everybody who worked at the quarry and who came to Monty's. She hung out here a lot, and eventually she and Monty became a thing. I don't think she ever had an official job here, but after she and Monty got married, Gail became his bookkeeper. She basically did everything Cindy does now, except she did it for free because she liked being around the people and helping out her husband. Gail was a freaking angel," said Cindy. "I was only 12 when she took over front of house, but she paid me cash under the table to do little tasks around the restaurant because she knew my family had it rough. $5 here and there went a long way." "I'll second the angel thing," said Rhett. Alex smirked at Seth and shook his head to say, "Sorry, this story's going to take forever." Heather continued, "Anyway, everything was trending the right way. The restaurant was going to expand, Monty and Gail were happy, and the community loved them. And then the quarry collapsed. I know it was a long time ago, but I'm sure you've heard about it." Seth obliged her with a grimace and nodded. "Didn't 6 people die?" More than that if you count all the suffering that followed, said Rhett. My dad turned from a fun drunk to a full-on alcoholic and died within 2 years of the collapse, said Cindy. Alex said, my aunt's daycare closed, so she took a job out of town and got hit by a semi when the highway froze over. Jamie, the other female customer at the bar, added, not everybody died physically. My brother pretty much turned into a recluse and eventually ended up homeless. He was at the quarry that day and saw it happen. His best friend was one of the workers who got buried. What was that, Lee? Cindy asked. Lee repeated his sign language, and she interpreted. Lee's mom committed suicide. His dad was also one of the workers killed in the immediate collapse. I'm so sorry, said Seth. For all of you. It seems like I'm the only one here who didn't lose somebody to that accident. Not me, said Kira. I just stumbled into this place one day like you. So the quarry collapsed and business just fell off a cliff, I'm guessing? Asked Seth. Heather said, well, as I was saying, everybody loved Monty and Gail and this little oasis they built. But after the collapse, the quarry shut down completely. The workers stopped driving through, the locals... Well, I think everybody else has pretty much explained what happened to them. Monty and Gail found a reliable base in the new and increasing number of alcoholics, but otherwise, business dried up. They let their employees, the ones who still showed up for work that is, all go. Gail hired Cindy to work front of house when she turned 16, and they took Lee in sort of on charity, right, Lee? She signed her question to him. He looked at Seth and nodded. Heather said, he basically worked for leftovers, and Cindy got paid waitress wages even though almost no one who stopped in here ever tipped. It was better than nothing, Cindy injected. Heather continued, things were really bad for Monty, and by default for Gail too. Eventually, he shut down the kitchen because the overwhelming majority of his income came from the bar. It only cost him to keep the kitchen running. And then, people just started disappearing. Some died of illness and disease, some took their lives for financial reasons or because of the general depression that took over this area. It was a dark time, the sort that can infect someone, even someone who had once been a light in this community. Monty ran out of hope in 1994. He changed. He started snapping at everyone, and he hit Lee once after he broke a plate on the floor. He threatened to fire us all the time, and we believed him. We couldn't believe he could still afford to keep us on anyway. Gail was probably all that stopped him from cutting every one of us off. She's all that kept the restaurant afloat during Monty's decline. Well, she might have just been trying to float us as long as she could, because we eventually found out she'd been trying to talk Monty into selling the place the whole time. He hardened against her. He didn't like being pressured into anything, so the more she pushed, the harder he held firm. He made this place his entire identity. He possessed it so that Gail could never sell it. He made it clear she would be killing a part of him if she got rid of it. Cindy picked up the next part. Gail probably hoped the part of him she'd kill would be the bad part, because eventually she found a buyer. She forged his signature, she handled all the books here, remember, and managed to seal the deal behind Monty's back. The day he found out was the same day we all found out, said Rhett. Wait, you were here too? What did you do? Seth asked. Rhett said, just a customer. Pretty regular one, though. Seth was astonished. If all this happened back in 94, that would make Rhett at least, well, if he was drinking at the time, 51 years old. He didn't look a day over 30. Shall I continue? Asked Heather. Everyone gave her apologetic looks. She took a long breath and resumed her story. I found Cindy waiting outside when I showed up to work that day. It was, about 4 o'clock, I guess. The restaurant should have been open since 2, but the sign said closed and the doors were locked. Stranger yet, Monty's truck was parked outside, but there was no sight nor sound of him. Cindy said, I had a key for the front door, but it wouldn't open after I unlocked it. I couldn't see what with, but it felt like somebody tied the doors together inside. Heather said, I told her to call the cops, and rightfully called me an idiot for not doing it sooner. I just didn't trust Monty anymore, you know? I wasn't sure how he'd react if I called the police on him in his own restaurant. I just didn't think he would. If I did, I would have called way sooner, I swear. Seth noticed the group's mood rapidly, almost in the span of a moment, grow intimately somber. He wanted to ask Cindy to get to the point so they could dissolve the uncomfortable air, but he waited for her to continue when she felt ready. So, the sheriffs came, she began again. They busted through the door, and right away we smelled something burning. Not like a fire, but like food that's fallen on the stove. The sheriffs told us to stay put and went straight back to the kitchen. One of them came straight back out, as green as that apple pear kinky back there. He puked right out there, outside the doors. And Cindy, the lunatic, ran around him to get inside, said Heather. Cindy, I thought there was some kind of accident. I wanted to see if I could help. Heather, an accident right after Monty tied the doors shut? Anyway, we've had this argument 1,000 times. And the point is, and I always tell this part, it's just too much, whispered Cindy. Lee put an arm around her. The point is, she got back there and saw what Monty had done. Most of it, anyway. There were human parts sticking out of empty pots on the stove, pieces of limbs. Their skin had been boiled and was hanging off, and dripping fat into the bottom of the empty pots. That's what we were smelling in the air, burnt fat and charred human flesh. But not only from the limbs. They found the head and torso in the oven. The hair had mostly been burned off, and the eyes, I can't even say it, but those parts weren't burnt. Not yet, because we barged in when we did. We managed to turn off the oven just as the body of Gail Villanueva had turned a glistening golden brown. She smelled like a Thanksgiving turkey. Stop it, this isn't true, said Seth. Are you hazing me? Is that what this is? You guys aren't even open tonight, right? You decided not to tell me to see if I can hang. Okay, I get it now. Nice one. Monty was in the freezer, Cindy continued. Seth noticed no one in the group had changed their affect in light of his accusation. Everyone remained committed to the joke. Or perhaps they were so serious because it wasn't a joke at all. After he'd started cooking his wife, he went into the freezer with a length of the same rope he'd used to tie the door shut. He rigged a short noose on one of the shelves and, yeah, that's basically it. So he wasn't going to, eat her, was he? Seth asked. No, Heather replied. What everyone thinks happens is he killed her in a rage over learning the restaurant had been sold out from under him. It was probably just a crazy spur-of-the-moment thing. Afterwards, he realized what he'd done and freaked out. He had some kind of mental break and started getting rid of the body the best way he could with the resources he had available. After some amount of time, probably not too long, he must have realized he couldn't destroy the evidence before everyone else showed up and decided to take the easy way out. Seth waited for more. Alex watched him carefully to see how he would react. Jamie and Kira exchanged pitying looks. Lee signed something to Heather, and she shook her head. He signed something else to Cindy, who signed back. She turned to Seth and said, They're both still here. If you stick around, I'm sure you'll see them. What, like they're ghosts? Seth asked. He had decided to play along, figuring they'd drag him along for a few more minutes, then Lee or Alex would excuse himself to the restroom and come back in a ghastly mask and a long black robe to startle him. Ha ha, good fun. Heather said, Gail usually appears in the morning, and Monty shows up at night. You probably wouldn't notice Gail unless you knew what to look for. She's often just an orb or a prism of light that floats through the dining room. She doesn't speak or really interact with us at all. but if you look at her, you feel warm and calm. Seth said, "Interesting. What about Monty?" "He's a dark spirit that only appears at night," Alex replied. "He'll try to disrupt things, stop the dishwasher mid-cycle, turn off the walk-ins to spoil the food, blow out the pilot lights on the stove, that sort of thing. Now that this isn't his restaurant, he's intent on seeing it fail." Heather added, "If you're back there tonight while you're closing and you see a shadowy figure out of the corner of your eye," "Or even right in front of you, plain as day," inserted Rhett, "that's Monty. Stay out of his way. Just by being here, you're on his bad side. But if you ignore him and don't touch anything until he leaves, he might leave you alone." Seth looked to each of their faces in turn. Heather, Alex, Rhett, Jamie, Kira, Cindy, Lee. Lee looked towards the kitchen door, then back at Seth, giving him a heavy nod. Seth said, "Guys, that's a great story. Like, a really good ghost story. But that's all it is, right? Monty didn't actually chop up his wife and cook her, and he's not really haunting the kitchen, right? It's okay, I get it. It's like hazing, isn't it?" "I understand how you feel. We'll just have to wait until you see something tonight," said Alex. Lee signed something, which Cindy vocalized. "Keep your eyes open." The absence of customers besides the 3 regulars continued over the next 2 hours, and Alex ran out of chores to task Seth with. So far, he'd made Seth clean the overhead vents, scrub the wall behind the prep counter, and scrape the oven trays clean. Seth's hands felt raw and tired, and he was covered in sweat, but he still felt satisfied with his work. Alex seemed to appreciate it too. Around 9, Alex announced that they should begin the closing ritual, as he called it. It mostly involved moving every table and counter to mop beneath and behind them, since the rest of the cleaning tasks were already done. When Seth thought he had mopped thoroughly enough, he found Alex out at the front bar again and told him. Lee's closing duties were already done too. Seth realized everyone but him now sat at the bar, including Heather, who'd come out from behind it and claimed a stool. "Hey, I'm done with the mopping," Seth told Alex. Alex set down his beer and gave Seth an inquisitive look. "All of it?" he asked. "Yeah." Alex's scrutinizing eyes grew narrower. "Did you mop the walk-ins?" Seth gritted his teeth. In truth, the mopping he had already done felt like a massive waste of time and water since they had barely stepped anywhere in the kitchen that night and hadn't prepared much food. They hadn't even set foot in the walk-ins during the tour. Why did they need to be mopped? But it was his first day. He was still the newbie, the rookie, the fresh meat. "Sorry, I didn't know I had to," he said. Then he cautiously asked, "Do I have to, really? Just seemed like we didn't actually do anything in there." Alex said, "It'll just take you a minute. Go ahead and get it done, and when you're finished, you can join us out here." Seth returned to the kitchen, refilled the mop bucket, and rolled it over to the walk-in cooler. Inside, the temperature certainly wasn't pleasant, but not unbearable for the brief cleaning. Seth sopped up the last shallow puddle and exited. When he pushed open the cooler door, he immediately thought someone else had come back to the kitchen. Lee had turned the lights in the dishwashing area off when he finished for the night, so half the kitchen now hosted shadows which spilled into Seth's area. But in that darkness around the wall, he could have sworn he saw a person walking by. "Hello?" he called out. He put the mop back in the bucket and rounded the divider into the dishwashing area. He stared into the shadows, confirming no one was back there. To be certain beyond any doubt, he turned on the light. Lee's polished sinks gleamed back at him, making him wonder if perhaps he had only seen a trick of reflecting light when he exited the cooler. Either way, nobody was hiding in there behind the divider. Seth returned to work. He opened the freezer. An opaque burst of frozen air billowed out, and the hair on his arms raised. He became retroactively grateful for the cooler's mild temperature, which he now missed dearly. Taking the mop bucket, he stepped inside. He remembered Alex's warning about the freezer and propped the door open with the mop bucket to let some of the light from outside in. A large covered rack on wheels dominated the center of the freezer. Seth mopped in front of it, watching his trail of warm water freeze seconds after he streaked it across the floor. When he finished the front half, he pushed the big rack aside. Hanging from the rearmost shelf, he saw him. Monty Villanueva. His feet were tucked back into a lower shelf to keep him off the floor. His head hung low, his longish gray hair covering his face. His arms hung stiff at his sides, purple and coated in a thin layer of frost. His clothes and hair bore a similar white layer all over. When Seth moved the rolling rack, he had accidentally bumped the frozen corpse, causing it to sway from the short rope which bound it to the shelf. He screamed and stumbled back. Unfortunately, in the brief moment during which he'd stopped moving the mop, it froze to the floor. As he tried to back out of the freezer, Seth tripped over it, toppling backwards against another shelf. Somehow, the mop bucket rolled away from the door and it closed, leaving Seth in total blackness with that frozen, ethereal corpse dangling just feet away. Seth righted himself and felt through the darkness. His hand found the rolling rack but accidentally pushed it further away. It rattled as it knocked against a shelf. He turned in the opposite direction and began feeling for the door. He couldn't remember whether it had a handle inside or not. It had to be able to open from inside, right? He found the crack of the door and traced it down to approximately where he thought a handle or latch would have been built. He only felt the smooth back side of the door, though. He tried pushing it with his hands, then his shoulder, but the door wouldn't budge. "Hey, can somebody help me?" he called through the thick door. "Hey guys, I'm trapped in the freezer. Could somebody open it?" He received no response and heard no movement on the other side. The door remained closed. Pounding on it now, Seth continued to yell for help. In the darkness behind him, he heard a dry thump. He turned toward the sound, which had come from the very place Monty's corpse was hanging. Panting now, Seth could feel his heart beating painfully against the walls of his chest. He could hear his pulse like a kick drum in his head. The floor right in front of him crackled and popped as the mop ice shattered beneath the weight of a footstep. "No!" Seth screamed. Another footstep came closer. "Stay back! Help! Somebody help me!" He desperately threw his body against the door in a final effort to force it open, but instead, his foot slipped on a patch of ice, causing him to fall against the bottom of the door on his side. His temple cracked against a shelf on his way down. The impact did not knock him out, but made him woozy. He felt a warm trickle down his cheek. A third footstep crackled closer. "Please," Seth whispered, attempting to stand. His hand froze to the ground where he placed it, and he had to peel it off. More warm wetness trickled down his neck, saturating the collar of his McDonald's shirt. If only he'd gone to work as scheduled that day. As his head became lighter, Seth heard Monty's feet plant directly in front of him. His heart raced faster, his head pounded harder, and the blood pouring from it poured quicker, landing and freezing on the floor around him. After one final attempt to stand, Seth finally blacked out. He opened his eyes an unknown amount of time later. His limbs felt frozen, though. His clothes bore a frosty layer which flaked away as he began to move. The air around him was still black. No one had come for him yet, which made him believe not much time had passed. Surely one of the employees or customers at the bar would have grown curious what happened to him after only a short while. He rose to his feet and pressed against the door. Still, it would not open. He knocked against it hopelessly, but to his utter surprise, the door opened. He stumbled into the warmth and light, passing Alex, Lee, Cindy, and Heather on the way. Rhett, Jamie, and Kira all stood further back in the kitchen, watching. "You okay?" Alex asked. "No, I'm not okay," Seth snapped. "Why didn't anybody come? I was banging and screaming in there. The door wouldn't open. I could have died." Lee quickly looked away. Heather grabbed the back of Cindy's arm. Alex stepped forward, closing the small distance between himself and Seth. Staring intently into his eyes, Alex asked, "Could have died?" Seth's face fell with his shoulders. Alex would not break eye contact. Everything in Seth's being told him to turn and look back in the freezer, if for no other reason than to confirm that Monty wasn't there, that he had been irrational. But still, there was a greater reason he wanted to look. He wanted to confirm that he himself wasn't still laying there on the frozen floor, his blood frozen in a pool around his head. He turned slowly, not breaking eye contact with Alex until his head was turned too far for his eyes to stay forward. And there, at the front of the freezer, impossibly, lay his own stiff, frosty corpse. Alex put a hand on his shoulder. Cindy took his forearm, then his hand, and Alex said, "Welcome to the family, friend. You're one of us now." You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and bonus Into the Woods episodes, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram at The Warning Woods. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.